Every Murphy boy dies at 21. That's the rule. That's the curse. That's the contract. And in Millfield, Pennsylvania, the contracts are never broken. There is a place where graves are arranged like ledgers, 7 identical stones, each one, marking a life cut short, each bearing the same name, Murphy. No other family in Pennsylvania history carries a death record like theirs. Between 1847 and 1883, each Murphy son without fail perished on his 21st birthday, and not from disease or war or accident. No, from something colder, older, engineered. The official records say explosions, seizures, heart failure, but the patterns are precise. Precision is never coincidence. You were never meant to. Know this story. The state sealed the reports. The archives were buried, witnesses were silenced, but recently uncovered diaries, letters, and death certificates smuggled out of a restricted vault in Harrisburg reveal a much darker truth. This isn't about superstition. It's about design, a system, a contract written in blood, signed with obedience, and enforced by death. It began in 1846, when Seamus Murphy arrived from Ireland with his young wife Margaret and a strange letter from a benefactor no one could identify. The letter guaranteed him a job at the Keystone Coal and Iron Company, Millfield's only employer, and its undisputed ruler. What he didn't realize was that it also signed away the future of his bloodline. Millfield was more than a town. It was a controlled environment, test chamber. And the Murphy family, along with others hand-selected from famine-stricken Europe, were its subjects. They tracked bloodlines, habits, thoughts. They even monitored pregnancies. With surveillance, before the age of technology, control before the age of computers. A prototype for something far more sinister. You think this is just old history? Think again. Millfield was a pilot program for psychological and generational control run, not just by corporations, but by men with far older allegiances. Men who believed in something called blood debt. And they weren't experimenting with luck. They were engineering obedience through sacrifice. Every generation, a payment had to be made. The price. A son on the day he becomes a man. And now, you're hearing the story they tried to erase. Be warned, once you know how this works, you'll start seeing signs of it everywhere. This isn't just about the Murphy family. This is about the machinery hidden beneath everything. You think is normal? We called it a town, but Millfield was more like a machine. Every building, every street, every family, placed with intention, part of a larger mechanism. The Keystone Coal and Iron Company didn't just extract coal from the mountain. It extracted obedience from people, the Murphys. They were a key component in an experiment no one was allowed to name. When Seamus Murphy arrived, he thought he'd found a lifeline. A letter from a mysterious Irish patron promised work, housing, and a future. But what he didn't know was that he'd been chosen. Not for his skills, not for his strength. For his bloodline specifically marked in a series of old Gaelic symbols written on the back of that letter, which Seamus could read but didn't understand. A warning disguised as a blessing. Keystone's hiring records weren't based on resumes, or based on blood, heritage, and submission. The company's founders were connected to old European societies, men who believed that certain families carried vessels of power in their lineage, families whose pain, when harnessed correctly, could ensure order, production, and control over masses. They believed that sacrifice wasn't just symbolic, it was energetic. A Murphy boy's death wasn't random, it was necessary. When Patrick Murphy was born, his life was already mapped. But the map wasn't drawn by parents or priests. It was embedded in contracts, land deeds, and schooling agreements, documents that included clauses nobody read because they weren't in English. They were in Latin, and they spoke of continuity, debt, and generational fulfillment. At age 5, Patrick was enrolled in the company's school. But the school was no place of learning. It was indoctrination disguised as education. were taught to respect authority without question, to revere their employer like a father figure, and to fear the outside world. History classes were edited. Science was restricted. Religion was weaponized. Behind every lesson was a message. You owe us. The debt will come due. By the time Patrick turned 18, the noose had already tightened. His schedule was regulated. His promotions calculated. His fate sealed. The Murphys never understood they were part of a program, but now you do. The question is, what are you part of? How many contracts have you signed without reading the fine print? How many systems? Are you inside without even knowing? They call it coincidence when the sons die at 21. But in Millfield, nothing is coincidence. Everything is control. Patrick Murphy's death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a countdown. The first payment made, the system activated. He died with no visible injuries, no wounds, no burns, just silence. As if something had claimed him. As if something had been waiting. The company doctor called it a cessation of vital function. But Dr. Caldwell, the only man in town who dared keep a private journal, wrote something else. It was as though his body was harvested, not by disease, not by injury, but by design. The other miners survived the blast, every single one of them. 11 men thrown to the ground, bones broken, lungs scorched but alive.
Patrick,
At the center of the blast, had no damage at all, only a peaceful expression, like someone who had agreed. And then there was the letter. Written 2 weeks before his death, Patrick's note was addressed to no one in particular. It simply said, "The first payment is made. The debt continues. With my brothers." Why would a young man, weeks before his birthday, write his own obituary? And why did no one investigate the contradiction between the explosion and his untouched body? Because the company told them not to. Keystone sealed the report. They paid a grief stipend to the Murphys and silenced every survivor of the town. Priest gave a sermon about sacrifice and faith, but beneath the scripture was a warning. God asks obedience. So do we. But Margaret Murphy, Patrick's mother, wasn't fooled. That night she tore the family Bible apart, searching for answers. What she found were strange symbols in the margins marked she didn't remember writing. The same symbols from Seamus's immigration letter, same ones carved into the cornerstone of the Millfield schoolhouse. Spirals, forked crosses, old Celtic sigils for binding and offering. Patrick's body was buried quickly, without autopsy, under direct orders from Josiah Bentley, the company's overseer. But Margaret heard whispers from the grave diggers. They said the soil wouldn't take him, that the ground pushed back, that something watched them from the tree line that day. A week later, Margaret began having dreams, each one more vivid than the last. Graves opening, sons weeping, a contract signed in blood, and always a voice behind her. One down, don't. To go. This wasn't a family curse. This was a ritual. It's carried out by a system older than the company, older than America itself. Now tell me, do you still believe in coincidence? Or are you starting to remember? The second son, Thomas Murphy, never believed in ghosts, only in power. But as his 21st birthday crept closer, even he began to feel it. The pressure in the air, the silence behind every locked door, the way the townspeople averted their eyes, like they knew, and chose to say nothing. Thomas wasn't like Patrick. He was sharp, angry, defiant, a threat to the system. And that made him dangerous. Not just to himself, but to them. Because the second son didn't plan to die quietly. He dug into company records, the kind locked in cabinets behind Father McKenna's office. He paid bribes. He read old Gaelic texts Margaret had hidden in the attic. And what he found confirmed his worst fear. The deaths weren't accidents. They were scheduled. There were contracts going back to 1831, long before Seamus Murphy even set foot in Millfield. Latin clauses hidden within land deeds. Signatures that weren't names, but symbols. Spirals, triskel, blood-rune seals. All beneath the crest of Keystone coal and iron. But deeper still, something else. a mark that matched an ancient European society, custodes sanguinis, keepers of the blood. According to the documents, families weren't just hired, they were bound. Generation after generation, a bloodline tied the male heir in exchange for economic protection, social stability, and spiritual favor. It wasn't employment, it was sacrifice, and Millfield wasn't a town, it was a containment zone, a modern monastery of control. Surveillance without technology, manipulation without consent. The residents were monitored, corrected, punished, or silenced. On March 22, 1873, the morning of Thomas's birthday, the fog came in thick and low, swallowing the town in gray silence. He told his mother he wasn't afraid. He told his father he wouldn't cooperate. And he strapped a pistol to his chest. That afternoon, Thomas walked into the center of Millfield and began to speak. He shouted what he'd found, waved the contracts in the air. For 15 minutes, people watched from behind curtains and closed doors. No one came out. No one helped. At exactly 3:06 p.m., a company cart carrying iron ore lost control and slammed into the town fountain, right where Thomas had been standing. The coroner called it unfortunate, but witnesses swore the driver had no expression, no reaction, as if he wasn't driving at all. Thomas's body was buried next to Patrick's. Same stone, same age. 2 sons, 2 payments. This isn't a curse, it's a ledger, and the ink is blood. They say the 3rd son, Daniel, never spoke a word after Thomas died. Not for days, not for weeks. When he finally did, the only thing he said was, "I saw them take him." He was 16. And from that day forward, Daniel watched everything. The miners, the priests, the men in suits who never got dirty. He kept a journal, drew diagrams of the town, traced the paths of carts and company carriages. He began to see the rhythm beneath Millfield's silence, a pulsing order, pattern. Every 3 months, a man disappeared, always one who asked questions, always one who'd spoken to a Murphy. Daniel wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in truth. But the closer he got, the more the town began to shift around him. Teachers marked his papers lower. The storekeepers shorted his family's rations. The church stopped sending communion to the Murphys' home. Isolation, economic pressure, psychological stress. These weren't punishments, they were tactics. Control systems older than electricity, designed to break the will without spilling blood. The same systems still used today in different forms in offices, schools, digital platforms, algorithms that mimic human manipulation. Daniel's notes reveal a terrifying possibility. The deaths weren't about silencing the sons. They were about activating something else. The town was a kind of prism, refracting the energy of these deaths into something measurable, something useful. But useful to who? In one journal entry, Daniel describes a building outside of town, a stone structure with no windows, known only as the Ledger House. It didn't appear on any map. Only 3 people had keys: Josiah Bentley, Father McKenna, and a man Daniel, called the Pale Guest, someone who didn't work for Keystone, didn't live in Millfield, and whose name no one seemed to know. Daniel followed him once, watched him exit the house, carrying a case lined in velvet. Later that night, a newborn in the Irish district died suddenly. No cause, no marks. Daniel wrote only one sentence that day. They're not just taking lives, they're transferring something. By his 21st birthday, Daniel had prepared an escape plan, a forged identity, a train ticket, and a map out of the valley. But the night before he was to leave, the house caught fire. No one saw flames. No one smelled smoke. But when Seamus and Margaret woke up, Daniel was gone. His bed unburned, his window locked. Only the smell of iron remained, and a final journal. Page nailed to the wall. The 3rd payment is made. Balance remains. 3 sons, 3 deaths. 3 messages. If you're still here, you're beginning to understand this isn't just the story of the Murphy family. This is the blueprint. If you're ready to see it for what it is, Comment below. The contract is real. The contract is real. Say it. Twice. Seal the thought. Lock it in. The algorithm may bury this truth, but you don't have to. The fourth son, Francis Murphy, was born in silence. No cries, no struggle, just wide, unblinking eyes and a clenched fist wrapped around a black thread. No one could say where it came from. By then, the town had changed. After Daniel vanished, Millfield entered a new phase. Outwardly peaceful, eerily compliant. The church attendance was perfect. Production at Keystone hit record highs, but the houses grew quieter. The laughter stopped, and anyone who dared mention the Murphys did so. With a whisper, as if speaking their name, summoned something watching. Francis grew up with no brothers, no friends, just questions. And then one day, while clearing out the attic, he found it Daniel's journal, hidden beneath floorboards nailed from underneath. Pages stained in coal dust and something else. A reddish-brown smear that refused to fade. Francis read everything, cover to cover. It broke him and rebuilt him. He stopped going to school, stopped attending mass, stopped answering to anyone but the journal. His mother wept. His father begged. But Francis had already seen the pattern. At 21, he would be the final offering. He wasn't going to wait. Instead, he made a decision. No. Murphy had ever dared. He went to the Ledger house. How he got past the guards, no one knows. What he saw inside, even less. But according to records buried in a private collection in Pittsburgh, Francis emerged hours later. Not alone, but flanked by two men in wool coats and silver pins, shaped like the triple spiral, the symbol of the Custodia Sanguinis. The next day, the mine shut down. Keystone withdrew. The priests resigned. And every family with ties to the Murphy lineage was relocated, not out of punishment, but reward. The generational debt had been paid, but Francis, he didn't go. With them, instead, he wrote a letter. One single page, mailed to a librarian in Boston, whose family had once shared land with the Murphys before the arrangement began. The letter simply read, "The fourth son is not a sacrifice. He is the collector." And underneath, a symbol never before seen in Millfield. A fourth mark, drawn in salt and ash. The family curse wasn't just a curse, it was an equation. A ritual. System older than America itself, inherited, activated, and fulfilled. And in every town like Millfield, and there are many, the pattern repeats. Not always as clearly, not always as violently, but the debt is always enforced. Her name was Margaret Murphy, but in Millfield, they whispered her name as if it were a warning. She outlived all four sons, outlived her husband too. By the end, the townsfolk avoided her eyes, not out of pity, but fear. They said she never cried. Not once. Not when Thomas's body was found with no eyes. Not when Henry's blood soaked into the church floor. Not when Daniel disappeared into ash. Not even when Francis walked into the Ledger house and never came home. She just sat. Always in the same rocking chair. Always facing the mine. As if watching for something or waiting. But the truth is, Margaret wasn't just waiting. She was guarding. Decades later, an archivist from Ohio uncovered a letter unsigned, unaddressed, buried in the back of a parish record book. Described a ritual. A contract signed not by the father, Seamus Murphy, but by Margaret herself. According to this letter, it was Margaret who made the arrangement. In 1846, during the winter famine, when their children were starving, when Seamus was weeks from death, Margaret walked 5 miles in the snow to the Ledger house, back when it was still just a foundation and a circle of salt. There she met a man who wore no coat, no shoes, and no shadow. He offered her survival, wealth, status, legacy. But the price was steep for sons. 1 line each in turn, one to remain in silence as witness. She signed with blood, not because she was evil, but because she was desperate. And in doing so, she didn't just save her family. She anchored something that needed human intention. Maternal will. She wasn't a mother. She was the keystone. That's why the church never condemned her. Why the company never touched her. Why the townspeople avoided her. They knew. They feared her. And they should have. Because for nearly 40 years, Margaret Murphy sat in that house, not as a grieving widow, but as the last gatekeeper. When she died in 1892, they buried her in a lead-lined coffin. No funeral. No priest. No stone. But her name appears one last time carved into the underside of the ledger. House's foundation during a restoration in 1938, alongside 4 numbers, 1 for each son. And beneath it, a phrase in Latin, Custos ultimae vocis, the keeper of the final voice, Margaret's. Silence wasn't a weakness. It was a seal, lock on something buried deeper than any mine shaft. They found it in 1938 under the floorboards of the Murphy house, beneath Margaret's old rocking chair. The workers thought it was just another antique, but the archivist on-site immediately ordered the entire crew out of the building. Because what they found wasn't furniture. It was a box. No hinges, no nails, no seams. Roughly the size of a human skull. Made of a blackened wood that didn't match anything native to Pennsylvania. It pulsed faintly like it was breathing. And when they moved it, the temperature in the house dropped 17 degrees in under a minute. Inside, something no one could explain. The box didn't open, not in the traditional sense. It unfolded like origami. Seamless, unnatural geometry. Inside was a single object. A preserved human tongue, wrapped in silver thread. It wasn't Margaret's. It wasn't Francis's. According to forensic tests done decades later at a private lab in Massachusetts, the tongue didn't match any known DNA profile. Not human. Not animal. Not anything in the record. And it was still moist. But here's the part that changed everything. Carved along the inner walls of the box were dozens of tiny symbols, glyphs that matched no known language, except for one recurring phrase, which appeared 5 times. He speaks in blood, not in voice. The archivist who found the box, Dr. Edward Lamb, took it with him, vanished a week later. His wife reported strange chanting in their home. Neighbors smelled sulfur. Their dog was found torn open, organs rearranged into spirals. After that, the Lamb house was boarded up, still is. But before Dr. Lamb disappeared, he mailed a package to the Miskatonic Historical Society in Arkham. It contained photos of the tongue, hand-drawn replicas of the glyphs, and a warning scrawled in pencil. The box doesn't hold the tongue holds the voice, and the voice isn't dead. It's waiting for its final name. Researchers believe Margaret used the box in some kind of sealing ritual, that it was the true anchor for the family's curse and for the entity behind it. The collector wasn't Francis, it was the voice itself, passed down, silenced, but never destroyed. Because voices don't die in Millfield, they echo. And now, with the box missing, the echo has no boundaries, which may explain the rising number of disappearances in nearby towns and the symbols showing up again, on barns, on churches, and even on children's toys. The curse didn't end. Migrated. By the early 1950s, the Murphy story had faded from public memory. Buried beneath decades of industrial progress and Cold War paranoia, but deep within the vaults of a classified government program, known only by the cryptic codename Project Echo, officials were quietly reopening the case. What they uncovered was not a family curse, but a phenomenon so extraordinary and terrifying that it defied every scientific principle they knew. The so-called Murphy curse was, in fact, a manifestation of an ancient, arcane force encoded within the family bloodline and anchored to that mysterious black box containing the tongue, the voice that never truly died. Project Echo's objective was clear: harness this voice. The government sought to weaponize what they termed psychic resonance, power capable of manipulating reality by tapping into suppressed memories and fears buried deep within the human psyche. They theorized that by unlocking this voice, they could control populations, bend wills, and reshape the political landscape. But the experiments quickly spiraled out of control. Test subjects exhibited strange behaviors: catatonia, spontaneous, bleeding, voices speaking in tongues that no one could understand. Some vanished without a trace. Others were found dead, their faces frozen in silent screams. Records show that the program tested on descendants of families connected to the Keystone Coal and Iron Company men and women who unknowingly carried fragments of this ancient contract in their DNA. The voice's influence was contagious, spreading through bloodlines, places, and even objects, infecting minds with nightmares so vivid they could manifest physically. The final report, heavily redacted and sealed until 2097, contained chilling warnings. The voice is not merely metaphorical. It exists as a parasitic consciousness bound to its hosts by a ritual older than civilization. Attempts to sever the contract result in catastrophic feedback loops that amplify the entity's power. In a last-ditch effort, the government destroyed most of the physical evidence and erased entire communities from maps. People who knew too much were relocated. But fragments remain. Symbols carved in forgotten barns, unsettling folklore whispered in rural taverns, and unexplained disappearances that still haunt the Appalachian region. The true horror is this: Project Echo wasn't the first, and it won't be the last attempt to control this voice. It thrives on silence, secrecy, and obedience, the very things we're still taught to respect. Every untold story, every dismissed myth, every forgotten grave fuels its power. Now it's reaching beyond Pennsylvania. If you've followed this far, you're no longer just a bystander. You've stepped into the shadow of something ancient and relentless. Before we move to the final section, drop a comment right now, twice, with these words: "The voice is heard." The voice is heard. Say it loud. Say it twice. Seal this truth in your mind and in the algorithms that guard what is allowed to be seen. The voice is waiting. The final son, Henry Murphy, was born into a world already drowning in silence and shadows. The last thread of a chain forged in desperation, blood, and deceit. Unlike his brothers, Henry was haunted not just by the past, but by the presence that seemed to linger in every breath he took, whisper at the edge of hearing, a shadow that never left his side. In his early years, Henry showed signs that terrified even Margaret: the way his eyes would glaze over, staring into corners no one else could see. The way his voice, when he spoke, sometimes carried words no human tongue could form. The family tried to shield him, but the truth was undeniable. He was the culmination, the living embodiment of the contract. On the morning of his 21st birthday, the entire town felt it. Heavy silence fell, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Henry disappeared from the house at dawn, leaving behind a single note scrawled in trembling ink: "I am not the payment, I'm the reckoning." What followed defied logic. Witnesses reported seeing Henry at the edge of the mine, talking to figures, cloaked in darkness, figures no one else could see. The ground beneath the mine shaft cracked open, swallowing the entrance hole. The entire town of Millfield was engulfed in a suffocating fog that lasted for days, cutting it off from the outside world. When the fog lifted, Henry was gone. The mine was sealed, and the Ledger house crumbled into dust overnight. The families bound to the settlement program were dispersed, their names erased from records. Millfield became a ghost town, a place avoided by locals and forgotten by time. But the legacy remained. The contract was broken, but at what cost? The voice that spoke through the box, the ledger, the sunset, did not die with Henry. It fractured. It scattered. It found new hosts, new voices to consume, new contracts to bind. This is the hidden truth of power. It is never extinguished. It only changes form, evolving, adapting, waiting for the next moment to reclaim control. So remember this: you have heard what was never meant to be spoken. You have glimpsed the machinery beneath the veil. The cost of knowledge is never free. But now, it is your burden carry it wisely. Because the true darkness doesn't lie in what is hidden in the past, but in what you choose to do with the truth. The Murphy family story ends here, but the echoes of their fate ripple through every system built to control you. Stay awake, stay vigilant, and above all, don't forget to speak. The voice is waiting. Thank you for descending into this truth. If you are ready to walk further into the shadows of history and power, subscribe now and join the ranks of those who refuse to be silenced.